All right, joining me now here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is Jean-Philippe Tremblay. Jean-Philippe is the director of the new documentary film Shadows of Liberty, which you can find at shadowsofliberty.org. Jean-Philippe, thank you so much for being on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so Jean-Philippe, right now you guys are actually kicking off a U.S. tour of the documentary. It's an independent tour. I'm actually very excited that I myself, along with another progressive comedian, Jimmy Tingle, will be doing comedy as part of a screening right here in Boston on Tuesday, the March 4th at the Regent in Arlington. But let's begin. We'll talk a little bit more about the tour in a bit, but let's begin by discussing the premise of the film, Shadows of Liberty.
Yeah, well, the film is about the media and the world we live in, basically. And what we're observing is that we have a mainstream media that dominates news and information. And that news and information is full of spin, and it doesn't actually give us the news and information that we need to live in a free society. So what we do in the film is we look at journalists who are trying to report stories that are important to us, that affects our lives, our security, our families, our well-being. And because their stories are about, you could say, power or government, they are confronted with conglomerates, big corporations, and their stories, and oftentimes even the journalists, are brushed aside. So that's what the premise of the film is, and we describe those stories. And basically what we're motivating people to do is to look at independent media for the people, that is paid by the people and for the people.
Yeah, and just the overall problem of the corporate control of news is really, really frightening. And within the film, you actually have several, I mean, it's something that most people should get, but you cover several glaring examples of when corporate control skews the news in some ways that are so undeniable, your jaw just drops. Let's talk about one of them. It's actually one of the first ones that you talk about in the film. It's actually the story of a journalist for CBS named Roberta Baskin. And when you watch this, it's like the way that the corporate ownership of CBS handles her story is it's journalistic malpractice, essentially. Tell us all about what happened with Roberta.
Yes, well, in the film, Roberta comes and speaks about her experience when she was working at CBS News. And we also have to mention that Roberta Baskin is not just there's nothing wrong with a small-time journalist, but she's actually a journalist that has received something like over 75 journalistic awards and was a foreign correspondent for CBS News. And she reported on a story about sweatshops in Vietnam run by the Nike Corporation. And she was actually able to do a first report, which was very successful. And when she did a follow-up report just before the 98 Olympics in Nagano, Japan, CBS News had done a deal with Nike to promote the Olympics. Therefore, her Nike story about Nike sweatshops in Vietnam was taken off the schedule. I mean, and we have to stress that this was actually scheduled, weeks ahead of time at CBS News. And then somehow one day Roberta goes to work and says, "Hey, what happened to my story? I thought it was going to be on, I forget the actual day, but let's say on Thursday night at 8 o'clock. And basically the story was taken off. And after her complaint, she was demoted to a really small job after everything she had done at CBS and throughout her journalistic career. And she was really just brushed aside. And that's a typical example of the challenge that journalists have today when they work for these big corporate conglomerates.
Yeah, and again, there was nothing factually incorrect about her story about Nike. There was no problem with the actual journalism that she had done. The problem was that CBS had a corporate deal with Nike, so much so that you reported there that during their coverage of the Olympics, you actually had CBS News correspondents wearing clothing with like a Nike swoosh on it. So you literally had like these supposed news anchors with this corporate sponsorship right on their clothing.
Well, that's where we really have to ask ourselves questions. When we start seeing news reporters wearing actual corporate logos when they're giving us the news about our health care, about the politics that's going on in our country and around the world, that's when we have to really stop everything and start asking serious questions about what kind of information are we receiving. And that's why we made this film. It's really to enlighten people about what's happening in their news, in information, the thing that really affects us in our everyday lives, and to ask some serious questions and really to start changing things.